This is the Wall Street Journal article on Biden's age. And I think it's important to dive into it. So let's get to it. Now, this is a media coverage over the Wall Street Journal article that came out yesterday that dove into the way that Biden's handlers have managed his obvious mental decline.
For the last 4 years, apparently, this president, duly elected, but this president was not capable of fulfilling the duties of the office. And his staff and the White House lied about it and kept it from the American people. It's an absolute scandal.
I'll say two things. One is that I think Joe Biden, despite all this, had a very successful tenure. You may disagree, but I think on policy as a Democrat, he had a very successful 4 years. But there's a bigger problem here. And that is that I think Democrats are at the point where Republicans might have been right after the Bush election or after the Bush term was up, which is that I think Democrats are starting to mistrust their institutions. And this goes back to a bipartisan effort to lie us into the Iraq War, not just by George Bush, but also by a lot of Democrats. It has to do with the fact that Barack Obama did not hold anybody accountable after the 2008 crisis, which also happened in George Bush's watch, but he became president. He never threw.
I guess they're slow walking themselves into some semblance of recognition, you know? I don't know. Like, it's a little bit too little too late.
Threw a hostage on the tarmac from Wall Street. You saw the rise of Bernie Sanders as a result of that, and you saw a lot of institutional Democrats, me included, saying, no, this is not the time. We have to stick with the institution. And I think you have a lot of Democrats now, me included, who are pretty sick of the institution and trusting people in the institution. And
You're a Democratic strategist. What do you mean? That's kind of funny.
Just one example, most recent example, I think, of people institutionally lying to the American people. And what you're ultimately going to see, and I don't have a problem saying this as a Democrat, is that you're going to see a Tea Party version rise up in the Democratic Party based on the fact that this is yet another marker of people just not trusting our leaders anymore. And I'm sorry to say that, but I think we brought this on ourselves.
Yeah. Even after that disastrous debate on this network, there were some people being like, oh, he had a bad night. He had a bad night. You know, and one of the quotes in that Wall Street Journal piece was, you know, there are good days and bad days. Today's a bad day. We'll deal with this tomorrow. The problem is tomorrow never came. It was just one bad day after another after.
I like the media that basically played the role of lying to the American public so routinely about something that was incredibly easy to comprehend. Like, it's just something you can't hide. When the president has his brain leaking out of his ears, you just can't hide that. You know, it's so visual. It's so graphic that the dumbest American can be like, I know what that's like. That's just like my grandfather years before he passed away, or maybe months before he passed away. You just can't hide that reality. And they, I think, did a terrible job of trying to do their very best. And now they have to play covering. They have to turn around and be like, oh, well, how could we have known? How could we have known? How could we have foreseen this? Would you say this is relatable to the FDR polio cover-up? Do you mean as in FDR was like hid the truth that he was in a wheelchair? No, it's not. Because FDR hid the fact that he was in a wheelchair and couldn't walk because the American public, he thought, would see him as a weaker candidate. It had nothing to do with his brain capacity. This is far more consequential. I don't give a fuck if the president's in a wheelchair. I care if the president's brain is working. FDR, on the other hand, his brain definitely was working. It's just that he was worried, and because he correctly identified that Americans would consider him to be weak if they saw him incapable of walking. Very different. Anyway, how the White House functioned with a diminished Biden in charge. Aides kept meetings short and controlled access. Top advisors acted as go-betweens, and public interactions became more scripted. The administration denied. Biden has declined. So let's take a look. During the 2020 presidential primary, Jill Biden campaigned so extensively across Iowa that she held more events. She held events in more counties than her husband, a fact her press secretary at the time, Michael LaRosa, touted to a local reporter. His superior in the Biden campaign quickly chided him. As three rode in a minivan through the state's cornfields, Anthony Bernal, then a deputy campaign manager and chief of staff to Jill Biden, pressed LaRosa to contact the reporter again and played down any comparison in campaign appearances between Joe Biden, then 77, and his wife, who was 8 years his junior. Her energetic schedule only highlighted her husband's more plodding pace, LaRosa recalls being told. The message from Biden's team was clear. The more you talk her up, the more you make him look bad. A small correction foreshadowed how Biden's closest aides and advisors would manage the limitations of the oldest president in U.S. history in his 4 years of office. This is propaganda and lies. Biden was just fine. He's just a shy guy. Stop lying to your audience. True. To adapt the White House around the needs of a diminished leader, they told visitors to keep meetings focused. Interactions with senior Democratic lawmakers and some cabinet members, including powerful secretaries such as Defense's Lloyd Austin and Treasury's Janet Yellen, were infrequent or grew less frequent. Some legislative leaders had a hard time getting the president's ear at key moments, including ahead of U.S.'s disastrous pullout from Afghanistan. Senior advisors were often put into roles that some administrative officials and lawmakers thought Biden should occupy, with people such as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Senior Counselor Steve Ricchetti, and National Economic Council head Lael Brainerd, and her predecessors frequently in the position of being go-betweens for the president. So basically, this caretaker government ended up delegating responsibility to appropriate parties, which is why you saw a bunch of stuff that was inconsistent with the 60-year track record of Biden in office. Very important to understand. This is why I've always maintained the position that it's not the president that is a standalone figure that ends up dictating policy, although the bully pulpit is probably one of the strongest parts of the presidency. And if you are diminished in your mental faculties, you are not going to be able to use the bully pulpit to whip Congress into shape, to dominate public understanding with whatever your agenda is. Having said that, however, there were opportunities here, like, for example, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and the formative role that they played in this administration. Labor was basically given out, contracted out to Bernie Sanders, and we saw the results of that. FTC, Elizabeth Warren. We saw the results of that. There were plenty of good things in terms of consumer protections that happened under this administration, and that was because Biden simply wasn't up to the task. So there is some benefit to this. There is some benefit to having this, old man running the show, but not really running it at all. But there was a tremendous amount of awfulness that also took place. The awfulness, of course, came in the form of foreign policy. They run the show. It wasn't Biden's own personal brand of ultra-Zionist tendencies that caused our relationship with Israel to get kicked into overdrive. It was that the people closest to him in his inner circle also channeled that opinion. The supposed brain trust, the supposed foreign policy, the foreign policy geniuses. Presidents always have gatekeepers, but in Biden's case, the walls around him were higher and the controls greater, according to Democratic lawmakers, donors, and aides who worked for Biden and other administrations. There were limits to who Biden spoke with, limits on what they said to him, and limits around sources of information he consumed. Throughout his presidency, a small group of aides stuck close to Biden to assist him, especially when traveling or speaking to the public. They body him to such a high degree, a person who witnessed it said, adding that the hand-holding is unlike anything other recent presidents have had. The White House operated this way even as the president and his aides pressed forward with his re-election bid, which unraveled spectacularly after his halting performance in a June debate with Donald Trump. 60 million Americans in real time saw that the current president was completely incapable of running the country, let alone putting on his own clothes. The only similarities that I can point to is basically Ronald Reagan in his second term when he had signs of Alzheimer's or dementia. Vice President Kamala Harris replaced him on the Democratic ticket and was decisively defeated by Trump in a shortened campaign, leaving Democrats to debate whether their chances were undercut by Biden's refusal to yield earlier. This account of how the White House functioned with an aging leader at the top of its organizational chart is based on interviews with nearly 50 people, including those who participated in or had direct knowledge of the operations. Many of those who criticized Biden's insularity said his system nonetheless kept his agenda on track. White House spokesman Andrew Bates said Biden earned the most accomplished record of any modern commander-in-chief and rebuilt the middle class because of his attention to policy details that impact millions of lives. Bates, who rejected the notion that Biden has declined, added that the president has often solicited opinions from outside experts, which has informed his policy making. He said it is the job of senior White House staff to have high-level meetings regularly and that they were executing Biden's agenda at his direction. He also said that staff alerted the president to significant negative news stories. Bernal, via the White House press office, declined to comment. This is a lie. They literally limited his interaction with the outside world. They also limited the negative press coverage. It's like a child. We had like a kid running the country. There were good days and bad days. The president's slide has been hard to overlook. The structure was also designed to prevent Biden, an undisciplined public speaker throughout his half-century political career, from making gaffes and missteps that could damage his image. So this entire article details how they limited Biden's public interactions, how they sheltered him from the truth, and how, because Biden was woefully incompetent and genuinely demented, that basically most of this administration's achievements and most of the steps that they took were not directed at the top by Joseph Robinette Brandon, but instead they were handled by specialists that were placed in front of him. It's something that we already knew, and it's something that we talked about, and it's something that was very easy to predict. This is something that I've been saying since 2019, talking about how ridiculous it is that Democrats are going to drop the incumbent's advantage by putting forth a person who will not be able to run for office again. Problem is, the Democrats, being the silly little incompetent party they are, refuse to put a successor as the vice president in the Biden administration and then build that person up. And this is precisely how we arrived at Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris was not chosen because of her acumen, her charisma, or any sort of ideological predisposition that she has. Kamala Harris was chosen not to outshine Joe Biden. First and foremost, Kamala Harris was also packaged as a simple identity politics slot. Joe Biden actively said, I'm going to pick a black woman. Joe Biden chose to look at the smears that the Republicans oftentimes apply to any person that is not white or a man, DEI, and adopt it and say, yes, I'm doing a DEI candidate. Now, this doesn't mean that Kamala Harris didn't have the bona fides. Right. I think that she has her resume is decent, maybe not for presidency, maybe not for vice presidency, but it's still, she's a competent person. Problem is, that's not what she was chosen for. She was chosen because she would not be able to outshine the demented president. A lot of this stuff unfolded when he also had the special counsel interview him, Robert Hur. Right? That was his name, I believe. That interview surrounding the classified documents investigation showed, according to Hur's own assessment, that Joe Biden was incapable of remembering key details about his own life, and that if presented in front of a jury, would come across as a bumbling old fool who was well-intentioned. If you recall, the media was very upset about this detail being revealed, except feel like he was a little bit vindicated, don't you think? He was vindicated because he was right that Joe Biden was a doddering old fool, but they insulated him nonetheless and had a relatively adversarial relationship with the media, despite the reality that the media played ball with the Biden administration, in my opinion, with the exceptions of the Afghan withdrawal, which was one of the only good things that Joe Biden did in terms of his foreign policy accomplishments. Yeah, this entire thing is... this entire article is Vindication, and all of the media coverage surrounding this Wall Street Journal reporting is basically them engaging in the age-old process of covering. To be like, oh, well, we couldn't have known, or oh, well, maybe he wasn't that bad. Or if he was that bad, well, it's really fucked up that they didn't let us know that he was that bad. It's not our fault. And the irony of the story is that Joe Biden's mental faculties being diminished wasn't a secret. It was something that even the dumbest Republicans were aware of. All right, let's watch the five lap up, do their victory lap over Brandon's senility.
Who is running our country? That's the question everyone is asking after a bombshell report from the Wall Street Journal blew the lid off Joe Biden's declining mental state and how the White House has been covering it up right from the very start. According to the Journal, signs that the commander-in-chief was diminished stretched all the way back to, quote, the first few months of his presidency, with aides adjusting his schedule, noticing Joe becoming tired if they went long, and he started making mistakes. So they kept meetings short and started controlling who he spoke with. And like a good little lapdog, the media aided and abetted the cover-up. Remember this lunacy?
F you if you can't handle the truth. This version of Biden, intellectually, analytically, is the best Biden ever. Not a close second.
I'm not even going to ask a question on that. It's so absurd. Jesse, they say that the 50 sources say they noticed in the first few months that he couldn't handle things. But do you remember they're using COVID as an excuse for him not to campaign, not to get out there and to have the basement campaign where, remember, cars, they would beep if they supported Joe Biden? There were 8 of them.
Yeah, so they kept the COVID structure throughout the rest of the presidency. And he was treated like an aging dictator, an aging king. You know, the same things they said about Trump were true of him. He was isolated. He was out of touch. He was.
It's pretty funny because they have like so much good footage of him just being a fucking bumbling old fool, stumbling around. You know what I'm saying? It's just, there's so much good coverage on here. They get to do this victory lap because even though they were doing it on partisan reasons, they were still correct. Even though they were doing this on partisan grounds, they still stand corrected. It also, once again, plays a role in undermining the integrity in the eyes of the broader public of mainstream outlets and makes it seem like Fox News was right all along. So that's a bit of a self-goal, a bit of a self-own from mainstream outlets once again.
Mentally unfit. People were keeping things from him. They wouldn't give him bad polling. They wouldn't give him bad headlines. He was AWOL during the lead up to Afghanistan. People were trying to get him on the phone at key moments. There's no way to get a hold of the guy. And he delegated his presidential powers to his staff, Judge. So when people ask, well, who's really the president? It was his staff. His staff were executing the duties of the president. And I think it was April 2021, right out of the gate, they were canceling meetings because he was having a bad day. So all this conspiracy theory about, Joe Biden shot, he's a puppet, it was true. I mean, at this point, we're going to find out he stole the election from Trump. At this point, the way things are going.
Jesse? I just had a thought that occurred to me, so let me just use my words here and see if I can get it out. When the Robert Hur report came out, do you remember there was a fury from the White House that Merrick Garland let it go out? And I have to wonder if Merrick Garland made sure it went out, so that he at least would have been like, yeah.
They can't even be right. Like they still have to basically engage in some level of some kind of conspiratorial reach, even when they're on the correct side, even when history has vindicated their position.
Trying to tell people like this was what was happening. One of the things in the article is that they scripted his interactions with his defense secretary, Lloyd Austin. No wonder Biden had no idea Lloyd Austin was missing in action for 3 weeks. They never spoke anyway. And if they did, there was a script. It's not a call center. He didn't have a way to communicate directly with his Treasury Secretary. No wonder they never talked about inflation as a problem for Americans. You had the chief of staff saying it was a high-class problem. The last thing I would say is Kamala Harris is absolutely complicit in the cover-up.
Exactly. And that's where I was going to Jessica. What happened in this White House was something that I don't think America has seen ever. We all knew what was going on. We sat at this table and actually thought about what was clearly the cognitive decline of a bobbling, dithering man. And then we were.
How much blame would you assign to Biden versus his staffers over the genocide? I still assign all the blame to Biden. I don't give a fuck that like Biden was mentally diminished. It's the same with George W. Bush. George W. Bush is still the signatory. George W. Bush, regardless of how stupid he is still signing off on all of these war crimes. I don't care that it was Dick Cheney that was the mastermind. I hate both of them. And also the staffers suck too. Make no mistake. I'm just saying that there is no abdication of responsibility. Anyway.